All right, good morning. It is Wednesday. You're at General and Housing. You're welcome. We're going to have a bill introduction today with a sponsor of H 448, an act relating to promoting and social equity and economic opportunity and cultural empowerment. And later on this morning, we are going to hear about H 184, which is an act related to exempting an owner of rental housing from renovation, repair, painting, maintenance, licensing requirements. And we'll get an introduction and a walkthrough. It's a very short bill. And then later on this morning, we're going to hear from Representative Demrow, who will be testifying on the changes that Ways and Means made to H66. It passed Ways and Means last week. It passed the Appropriations Committee yesterday, and it will be on the floor tomorrow and Friday. So we're going to hear from the presenter of the bill from Ways and Means. And just as a quick process thing, what will happen tomorrow is that Representative Chestnut Tangerman will make the general and housing presentation on the bill, and then Representative Demrow will do the presentation from Ways and Means. And there are differences, of course, at least textually, some of it's substantive, some of it's technical changes. And then appropriations will make their statement on it as well. And so tomorrow, what we will do is, or today, what we'll do is we'll hear from Demrow, Representative Demrow, and then we'll have a straw poll, or actually it'll be more than a straw poll because it's on the amendment to the bill, and then we'll report that later. It'll make presentation on the floor kind of not awkward, but just our bill, our version of the bill will be determined or will be delivered, and then they kind of come in and talk about the changes that they made.
And just to confuse things, I think the presenter for Probst will be Robin Chai. Robin and Robin.
Round Robin.
Talking Robin.
Yeah. Okay. So that's our morning, and then assuming that we're going to be on the floor all afternoon with the amount of bills that were on notice. So it's a busy week for sitting on the floor. Make sure you get up and stretch at certain times, because these days can be like watching oil paint dry sometimes. But that's physically, it's important to stay engaged on the floor. All right, with that, I will, Representative Chena, do you know all of us? This is your first time in committee, I believe, this year, and we're decidedly different committee than we were in years past. But do you know us all? Have you?
Maybe people could say your name and where you're from again, so at least I know all of your info.
Sure. So Representative Tom Stevens from Waterbury, represent Washington Chittenden District.
Joe Parsons, Newbury, Topsom, and Groton.
Emily Krasno, South Burlington.
Caleb Elder, Starksboro.
Elizabeth Burrows, Windsor 1.
Larry Labor, Essex, Orleans, District 1.
What towns are those?
12 towns. You want to hear?
Oh no, it's okay. That's why you're. Which one are you?
I live in Morgan.
Morgan, thank you.
I live in West Windsor, I can say that.
West Windsor.
Yeah. Representative Mary Howard, and I live in and represent Rutland District 6.
Is that the town or the city?
City.
Robin Chestnut Tangerman, and the large metropolises of Middletown Springs, Tinmouth, Rupert, Paulet, and half of Wells.
Okay, well thanks. I'm Brian Chena, I'm in Burlington, and I live in the Old North End and represent part of the Old North End in the East District, Chittenden 15. So, and I'm here today to present to you on H 448, which is an act relating to promoting racial and social equity in economic empowerment and economic opportunity and cultural empowerment. I'm always afraid I'm gonna share the wrong screen, so. I haven't started yet, so I'll let you come in and then I'll start. So. That's interesting because in my mind, I wanted to play a dramatic beginning. I really wanted to do that, but I was like, I don't want to push.
John getting so upset. Get time.
I wouldn't
No rush.
So for those watching on YouTube, I don't know if you can hear the sound effects unattended. So here we are.
I just want to remark that I was gone for one day. One day.
It was like this all day yesterday, Tom.
I almost tuned in to hear a conversation on standard and daylight savings time. Just because I didn't, because I knew exactly what it would be like, and I'm sure it was. All right, Representative Howard, are you ready?
I think so. I'm not touching this.
Okay, all right.
So without further ado,
Yes.
rewind. H 448, an act relating to promoting racial and social equity and economic opportunity and cultural empowerment. And this piece of legislation was written with a team at the Vermont Racial Justice Alliance, our policy, I believe we were called the Policy Committee, as part of the ACT agenda from last biennium, which asked the legislature to acknowledge, create, and transform. Acknowledge the history of systemic oppression, racism in Vermont, create new structures of government to address systemic racism and to create equity, and to transform existing pieces of government. And this is the legislative intent of H 448. That equal opportunity is a fundamental principle of American democracy, that equal access to economic opportunity and to cultural empowerment are priorities of the state of Vermont. However, structural racism, defined as laws, policies, practices, representations, and other societal norms that work together to deny opportunity, structural racism has resulted in wealth disparities and cultural disempowerment among Vermonters. And that wealth disparities are a function of not only access to income, but also the ability to have access to land, to property ownership, to cultural preservation and empowerment. And these things have been impacted by not only race, but also many other factors like ethnicity, sex, geography, language preference, immigrant or citizen status, sexual orientation, gender identity, socioeconomic status, and disability status. Wealth disparities and cultural disempowerment directly and indirectly affect the health and wellness of individuals and communities. And you can see the original state seal of Vermont. And now, as the state seal evolves, we talk more about our history, that our economic system was built on land that was taken from Abenaki and other indigenous persons, and the structures of our economic system were constructed with the labor of enslaved persons. And the legacy of settler colonialism and chattel slavery has been systemic racism and discrimination that's embedded in many aspects of our modern way of life on this land. And the relationship between people and the land has been used to oppress people over the past several centuries. The laws and policies of our state and nation severed indigenous persons from their land while denying them, Black persons and other persons of color, from having the opportunity to access and to own land. These actions of the state led to systemic racism that has impacted all Vermonters who have historically suffered from discrimination and who have not had equal access to public or private economic benefits due to various protected statuses that I won't read every time, but I think it is important to acknowledge. And the actions of the state have led to the erasure or appropriation of culture for the descendants of slaves or enslaved persons and indigenous persons. And so here we are today with a modern branding of Vermont. Legislative intent, in order to offer repair for the systemic discrimination faced by many persons throughout the state over the past 4 centuries, The state of Vermont must engage in a just transition to an economic system that systemically undoes racism instead of reinforcing it. And efforts to remedy wealth disparity in the US have traditionally looked to the free market economy for solutions to the very problem that economy has created. However, there's been increased recognition that improving access to economic opportunity and cultural empowerment will require broader approaches. And in order to rectify the history of inequity, we must create economic opportunity and cultural empowerment using new systems that empower and center Vermonters who've historically suffered from discrimination. And so, in the legislative intent, it talks a bit about the history of Vermont, which I tried to capture through the evolution of the seal. And here we are at this moment in history. Who are we going to be for the next 100 years? That is the question. So, as a state. So now here's the findings, which we will not get into today because you could teach a college course on the findings alone. So there's lots of findings that were reviewed and went into the creation of the legislative intent and the findings section of the bill, which is detailed. So this is going to be posted online if people want to look through the record whenever it's possible to click on something and find it immediately. I try to find it or I try to put the link there so that you can find it. So you can see here's a report to, the Act 54 report, which is available online, or a declaration of racism as a public health emergency. But then there's books and publications that I don't have the links for. Sorry. A lot of stuff you can find if you Google it. You can see there's more here. And so here's the purpose of the act: to invest in systems of economic advancement and cultural empowerment as a way to move towards greater racial and social equity in wealth distribution, health, resilience, and economic and cultural prosperity. How do we do that? Since we're the legislature, we're going to do it by changing the law. So here we go. So there's going to be a few examples of changing the law. So here we have these are principles in statute, section 410 VSA, economic development principles review and assessment. So the Racial Justice Alliance proposed adding number 5, you can see it's in bold. And Vermont embraces its responsibility to course correct the historical impact of economic exploitation and exclusion from opportunity due to race and ethnicity for American descendants of slavery and the broader Black, Indigenous, and other persons of color community. I will say I've testified in this committee before, and people have said, what about people with disabilities? What about LGBTQ plus people? What about women? What about, and I would say, good point. And you could discuss that. You could take testimony from different groups, but I'm here today presenting a bill that was written by the Racial Justice Alliance that centered Black people and American descendants of slavery. And so that is why there's language here based on race. So that's the perspective this was coming from. But it might benefit the committee over the next year to hear from other groups about this issue. And that is what happened in this committee behind Truth and Reconciliation, is there was other groups who were heard from and incorporated over time. So I just want to acknowledge that up front to prevent someone saying, why didn't you, talk about this group and that, well, that's why. And it's not meant to exclude other groups, but it's meant to honor a perspective that is erased over and over and over again, which is the Black perspective. So moving on, in this part of the bill, and Ledge Council can do the walkthrough with you. I did this because I think it's easier to just kind of explain things than have all the numbers and stuff and, all the little subsections that the way the bills are in. So I'm happy to come back for that, or Ledge Council can go through it with you. So in current statute, under the part that talks about the duties of the Director of the Office of Economic Opportunity, there's a list of duties, and we propose adding to them number 11, to correct the historical impact of economic exploitation and exclusion from opportunity due to race and ethnicity of American descendants of slavery and the broader Black, Indigenous, and other persons of color community. You can see here, under those duties, I'm going to rewind a little bit, that they have authorization to allocate financial assistance for community service agencies and programs. And so you can see like there's all, especially when it has to do with causes of poverty. You're trying to address poverty as an acute problem. And you can see here that, they have the authority to allocate funding around employment, education, use of income, housing and living environment, services for substance use disorders. I think this is outdated language. I can't believe what I'm reading actually. So if you do change this, you might want to update some of this stuff around the way they're talking about substance use disorder. This is why we have technical corrections over time. And then this here in this part, you see to get emergency assistance, to remove obstacles and solve personal problems and family problems, to achieve greater participation in the affairs of the community, to make more frequent use in other programs of this chapter, to coordinate, establish linkages between government and social service programs, and then we add to it to correct the impact of economic exploitation and exclusion from opportunity. Moving on. So now in this section of the bill, we propose that there be created a Vermont Department of Cultural Empowerment and Economic Advancement within the Agency of Commerce and Community Development that would work to ensure programming implementation to a statewide cultural empowerment and economic advancement network consisting of 4 community empowerment centers located in different regions of Vermont. And it would create a Vermont Department of Cultural Empowerment and Economic Advancement grant fund to design and implement a grant program for qualified organizations and collaboratives led by Black, Indigenous, and other persons of color that provides grants to support programming through the Cultural Empowerment and Economic Advancement Network. And the bill has 10 million, which to be honest is like one of those numbers, you pick a number, it's a placeholder, because for those of you who are newer, maybe you haven't been through the budget process, but you put a number in and it goes like, and then at the end, it's like this much. So aim high. And 10 million is not even high for the amount of money that probably needs to be invested into this work. But that's it. Consider that a placeholder. I'm not fixated on it. It could be $9,999,999. So, all right, moving on. We've got the Department of Cultural Empowerment and Economic Advancement administering grants from that fund to provide cultural empowerment programming, which could educate on the true history, contributions, and resilience of American descendants of slavery and other Black, Indigenous, and other persons of color. Serve as a resource, facilitate, and assist in the implementation of American descendants of slavery cultural commemorations and celebrations. This, for people who may not know what those might be, Juneteenth is an example. Martin Luther King Day is an example. So, but anyway, moving on. Facilitate various additional cultural activities. Serve as a central hub for access, cultivation, creation, and curation of cultural arts. And then, so we're talking about the cultural empowerment piece, and just maybe to summarize this, the idea is that the history of the country has erased and degraded culture. Intentionally, people have been cut off from their culture over and over and over again by the actions of the state. It could be DCF taking kids from their family. It could be people being put in prisons. It could be people being, kicked out of their homes and out of their communities being torn apart. What we're asking for here is an investment in community centers, in helping people to rebuild, and preserve and share culture, which is an important part of human health and wellness. Having a sense of identity, having a sense of purpose, having culture, having, connection to community. So the potential impact on the social determinants of health of investing in cultural activities and arts is massive. I just want to emphasize that. I think too often in this legislature, people focus on money. and not on social capital. So I feel like it's important to give extra attention to that, because all I ever hear here is money, 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 and that's the whole part of the problem. Like, and speaking of culture, like Black culture is one of the greatest commodities in this country. You know, it's been bought and sold, and it seems like over and over again that like Black culture is treated as something that's to be extracted and used by not Black people. And so I think it's really important here to acknowledge like that there needs to be an investment in the preservation and sharing of culture by Black people and for Black people. And as a person who was on the steering committee of the Racial Justice Alliance, I feel I have to, when I present on these bills that were written with the Racial Justice Alliance, that it's my duty to make sure that I'm conveying that message. So I try to do it as much as I can. So moving on. This part is more about the money, the thing that makes people like their eyes get wide in the State House. So so this is about like economic advancement, about establishing a business cultivation and support program, which would provide small business technical assistance, small business grants and loans, small business to business mentorship program, technical assistance, and small business procurement. I'm sorry, I said business so many times in this one. Small business procurement contract assistance. I'm joking because it's in the morning and I'm trying to keep people like from falling asleep, but this is also very serious. Okay. So when people, have been historically marginalized and cut off from economic resources and not taught the tricks that other people know about how to make money, it's harder to navigate the system and harder to get started. So it is important that the state don't just throw money at people, but that the state says, let's engage with people in learning how you can take something and make it something. How do you navigate things? And so that's what this is all about. And there is some work in Vermont that has been done in this area that I am not the witness for. You could talk to
PLC.
what was that?
BTPLC.
Is that the professionals? Yeah, exactly. Professionals of Color Network, or Curtis Reed, or there's others out there who've been doing this, or Mark Hughes. There's people who are doing this work who could come in and talk about the work that they're doing and help, maybe clarify what has been done and what is needed. And so anyway, moving on. Business to business development. All right. So here we have the Department of Economic Development in collaboration with the Vermont Economic Development Authority, the Vermont Center for Emerging Technologies, the Vermont Small Business Development Center, and other relevant stakeholders shall design and implement the BIPOC Business Development Program, purposes of which are to increase the number of and provide support to BIPOC business startups, provide BIPOC-owned businesses with broader access to capital, provide BIPOC-owned businesses with technical assistance. So this is another area where we want to learn a little bit about what the state has been doing. I believe there was a contract because we presented this in Economic Development Committee last year. There was some work in that economic development package around this area. So it isn't exactly what we asked for. So we might want to, if you do want to, you might want to take further testimony or ask the Commerce Committee to take some testimony on that and look at what worked, what didn't, and how it could be expanded. So I just want to acknowledge that. Because I think sometimes we present things and then people are like, we are already doing that. I hear that a lot too. I think sometimes people don't realize that it's not the same thing, but moving on. Business procurement and career advancement. So this is really important. If you look at who applies for state contracts and who gets them historically, okay, what would you see? And what would we expect to see? And so considering the history of systemic racism, it's important to acknowledge that there isn't really going to be equal access even when we say there is. You could say the door is open. You can have an open door, but if people don't know the door is open, they're not going to come in. That's really like, a way to think about it. So we would increase state government outreach to BIPOC-owned businesses for participation in bidding, that we would provide to the technical and other assistants that want to learn how to submit a bid, and establish a minimum percentage that would be awarded to BIPOC-owned businesses And the Secretary of Administration and consultant in consultation with the Racial Equity Director should adopt rules and require each agency and department in the state to implement policies and procedures designed to create pathways for career advancement for current and future employees who are members of the BIPOC communities in the state. So I do want to comment on that I'm going to use an example of a really good friend of mine who because I think concrete examples sometimes help. I have a friend who I went to college with, and we both went to Dartmouth College, which is a school with a vast network of connections. Like if you want to do business and play the game, you can get connected with people. And I, of course, became a musician and moved to Vermont and became a social worker. But she went to back to New York City, where we both come from that area. And she worked in various corporate jobs. And over again, she's a Black woman. She's Haitian. I'll say that because I didn't say that yet, I don't think. So over and over again, she watches young white women and white men come into the company, sit at the table, say the same thing she says, and they get promoted over and over and over again. She comes in late, they write her up. Other people come in late, they get away with it. It's over, and she's my age. I'm getting old enough. I don't want to say it on the record, but middle aged, getting AARP things in the mail already, and she has a kid and everything, and people are 23 and they're getting promoted. And what's the difference between her and them? Besides their age, there's race and gender sometimes, although the white women are advancing. So I think it's important to acknowledge that whether it's intentional or not, that people of color are not treated equally when it comes to advancement and in their careers. So it's important that the state, and this is what the last part's about, thinks about how do we make sure that people are not being overlooked because of race. This does not mean giving someone an advantage necessarily. It doesn't mean promoting someone because of race. It means making sure we do not leave people out because of race. So I want to point that out. So moving on. I have 7 more minutes. I want to make sure there's time for questions, and we're almost at the end, so I'll go a little quicker. Continuing education. I didn't skip anything. No. Okay. Continuing education and apprenticeship. So the Department of Labor, in collaboration with the state colleges and the Vermont Training Program within the Agency of Commerce and Community Development, shall design and implement 5 continuing education and apprenticeship programs for members of BIPOC communities in the state. And then I'm not going to elaborate because I want to make sure there's time for some questions. So this final slide, dismantling systemic racism in Vermont. So I think it's important to recognize that this bill is part of a body of work that goes back several years and a commitment that the state has made to dismantling systemic racism in Vermont. You can see here in 2017, Act 54 acknowledged racial disparities in Vermont. You can see that in Act 9 of 2018, we hired the Racial Equity Director and committed to dismantling systemic racism. That is the language that we committed to in statute. That we passed Act 33, which in 2021, which created a Health Equity Advisory Commission empowered to address disparities and promote equity in healthcare. We passed JRH 6 in 2021, which declared, it was a resolution that declared that racism constitutes a public health emergency and committed, quote, to eradicating systemic racism. We passed Act 182 in 2022, which was S226. It was a housing omnibus bill, and that came out of this committee. Thank you. And it included an amendment based on H273. This created a land access and opportunity board, and thank you for your support of that board, continued support of that board. And then we passed Proposal 2, which was approved by the voters in the last election in 2022, which amended the Vermont Constitution to ensure that slavery is completely prohibited. And this serves as a foundation for addressing systemic racism in our state's laws and institutions. So next step, it would be bring in witnesses and hear testimony. Take action on this bill to continue to follow through on our commitment to eradicating systemic racism by promoting racial and social equity in economic opportunity and cultural empowerment. And whether that means you pass the bill or whether it means you take testimony on it and it influences other work, I think what's important here is that the state keep working towards dismantling systemic racism by promoting racial and social equity in economic opportunity and cultural empowerment. So thanks. I think we have a few minutes for questions.
Yes.
I guess maybe it's not a question, but a comment that the internship, picking out one piece of the bill, but the internship piece was one that I certainly piqued my interest. There's just so much work, I think, with career tech education. I do happen to sit on the board of VSAC, and that's an organization that's been tasked with standing up some new grants kind of post-COVID with some more money, but I also know it's an organization that's looking for better ways to serve also like non-white Vermonters and underserved Vermonters. And I think that that's an interesting connection with some of the trades and career advancement, entrepreneurship that can kind of follow up from some of those paths, and also a place that that we haven't seen these opportunities before. So anyway, it just kind of the whole bill concept is one that I support, but that concept is one I haven't heard before. So I like that.
Thank you, Representative Chino, for it. And, one of the things that I struggle with is when I hear, so the term institutional racism is so broad and all-encompassing that it's actually, I find it disempowering. It's so big. So what is the step that I can take? What's the access, the entry point? And this has a lot of specificity that I find missing in other things. And I appreciate your analogy of the door's open, but if you don't know the door's there, or if you feel you're not dressed right, or you didn't get an invitation, or then it might as well not be a door.
Or someone's gonna like attack you if you walk in. That happens a lot. It's maybe not physically, but emotionally, it happens. So.
Yes.
Yeah, so actually, thank you for mentioning the door, not knowing the door. That's actually more prevalent. So last year, a series of organizations did extensive work on this. I facilitated some focus groups with BIPOC business owners and entrepreneurs to ask questions and understand better. One, why did you leave the workforce? And a lot of it was because of workplace racism, discrimination, microaggressions, and toxic work environments that was causing significant health problems for people of color in the state of Vermont. And so what happens is we're looking at economic development, we're looking at workforce, where's our workforce going? People are leaving toxic workspaces because it's not conducive to their health. What we found in doing some of the focus groups, Main Street Alliance, and Vermont Professionals of Color. I worked with Vermont Professionals of Color because they were not only BIPOC focus groups, they were focus groups for small business owners in general. And so I worked more focused with Vermont Professionals of Color, trying to understand better what were some of the barriers. And the barriers were technical assistance, funding, education, and access to resources. And so because it's not that people don't want to work, they don't have access to the things to help them be more efficient in their work, whether that it be for themselves or other people. And so when we look at these things and we talk about the institutional racism in Vermont, it is so globalized. However, therein lies the problem, because it's so ingrained in everything that we do and everything that we have. We have to address it, and it has to maintain that globalized thing. Thank you for talking about the erasure, because that is often what happens, is that we bring in all these other things and then it becomes something else and it gets erased again. We're back to square one. And so until we can start putting the hyper focus on the Black experience in business and professionals and education and advancement, then we're not going to really get anywhere. So thank you for your work on this, and I really appreciate it. And your presentation was wonderful, because reading through the bill was kind of complicated. So the presentation was far more helpful.
Thanks.
Can I ask, Representative Lamont, when you just said erasure at the end, I just want to make sure I understood what you were talking about. Are you talking about when Brian was saying that there's a tendency with bills like this to say, what about
Yes.
this, what about that, and kind of adding to the core focus of what the bill is, and in so doing dilute that I've got that right?
Yes.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you.
All right.
Thank you.
Let's stop right here. Go off live. Thank you, Representative Chino,
You're welcome.
for the presentation.
Brian, it's good, Bill.